The man boarded the flight with the kind of quiet determination that had gotten him this far in life. His suit was crisp and his shoes polished, but his mind was far from the boardroom in California, where a big deal awaited him. Instead, it lingered on the chaos of the morning flight delays, the missed calls, and the emails that had piled up while he rushed to make this flight. As he walked down the narrow aisle looking for his seat, he felt the usual nerves of a business traveler preparing for a long journey. But today something felt different, a strange weight in the air, like a cold breeze that didn't belong in a cabin full of warm bodies. He shrugged it off at first. It was probably just the exhaustion from the early morning hustle, or maybe the pressure of the upcoming meeting. But even as he took his seat, something gnawed at him. He glanced around the cabin, looking for signs of anything that might explain the unease. There was the usual bustle, people getting settled, stowing their bags overhead, pulling out books and headphones. But in the corner of his eye, he saw her, the flight attendant, who had been standing near the front. Her eyes briefly met his before quickly darting away. As though he had startled her, she didn't smile or nod. As she did with the others, her gaze lingered for just a second too long, as though she was sizing him up, trying to decide whether he was worth acknowledging or not. He didn't understand it at first, but the discomfort that grew in his chest was undeniable, a quiet but growing sense of being unwelcome, like he didn't belong there, like he was the odd one out in a place where he should have been treated like everyone else. And then she moved closer past him, without a word, her eyes not even meeting his. As she began to check the safety equipment overhead, he could feel the slight tension in the air around her. She seemed distracted, nervous, almost, but her eyes avoided his entirely, as though he wasn't worth her time. He took a deep breath and leaned back in his seat, shaking his head at himself. He was imagining things. This was just a flight, just another day. But as he glanced at the other passengers, he noticed how differently they were being treated. The flight attendants were smiling, chatting with the elderly woman across the aisle, asking her if she wanted anything to drink, offering a blanket with a soft and polite tone, while the man beside him got an extra snack with a warm, "Enjoy your flight, sir." But when it was his turn to ask for something, the flight attendant's face tightened, her lips pressed into a thin line, as she turned away slightly, offering a curt yes and nothing more. It wasn't a huge thing, but it left a bad taste in his mouth. Why was he being treated differently? Why did he feel like he was invisible, like he didn't matter? Was it his race? Was it just coincidence? He shook the thought away. He wasn't the kind of person to make everything about race. That wasn't who he was. But the feeling of cold indifference didn't go away, no matter how hard he tried to ignore it. As the plane began its ascent into the sky, the sounds of the engines humming steadily filling the cabin with a white noise that usually made him feel at ease, he closed his eyes for a moment. But even then he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He opened them again, staring out the small window as the city of New York grew smaller beneath them, wondering what it was that made him feel so on edge. And that's when it happened again. She passed by him once more. This time her glance was even colder than before, almost as if she was avoiding looking at him entirely, and his stomach sank. He couldn't explain it, but he knew one thing for sure: something about this flight wasn't going to be ordinary. The flight had settled into a dull hum as the plane leveled out, cruising high above the clouds. The young man tried to distract himself with his thoughts, but they kept wandering back to the flight attendant and her cold demeanor. He kept telling himself it was nothing, he was overthinking it. But the way she avoided his gaze made him uneasy. It wasn't just a fleeting glance or a casual look away. It was deliberate, like she didn't want to see him, like he didn't deserve to be noticed. He glanced around the cabin at the other passengers, hoping to find some reassurance. But what he saw only made things worse. The elderly woman across the aisle had been given a pillow and blanket, and now the attendant was smiling down at her, offering a gentle hand to help adjust the blanket, as if she were her daughter. Another attendant had just handed a drink to a man 2 rows ahead with a laugh and a joking comment. But when the young man tried to catch her eye, she barely nodded before walking away without a word. No smile, no acknowledgement, and it stung more than he cared to admit. He felt a strange mix of frustration and confusion. What was it about him that made her act this way? He had been on dozens of flights, and never once had he felt singled out, never once had he felt ignored to this extent. But today something was different. It was as if he were invisible, as though he didn't belong in this space, despite paying the same fare as everyone else. Was it the way he looked? Was it his skin? Was it just some random fluke of a flight attendant who had a bad attitude? He couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. As the hours passed and the plane sailed through the sky, he tried to focus on his laptop screen, the work he had to finish, the emails he had yet to respond to. But every time he looked up, she was there, walking past him on her way to the front of the cabin, her eyes never meeting his, always focused on the floor or the passengers to the side of him. And each time it happened, the knot in his stomach tightened a little more. He leaned back in his seat, trying to push the thought away. Maybe it wasn't anything. Maybe he was just being overly sensitive. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Something about the way she treated him didn't feel right. It was more than just neglect. It was something colder, something more deliberate. He had seen that look before, but only in places where prejudice ran deep, where people tried to make you feel small for no reason at all. And then the announcement came over the intercom, the captain's voice crackling through the speakers as the plane began its descent into a more turbulent patch of air. Ladies and gentlemen, please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. We are approaching some rough weather. The seatbelt sign flickered on, and passengers began to shuffle nervously in their seats. The young man tightened his grip on the armrest, his mind racing at the possibility that the situation might get worse. But even as the plane rocked slightly, and the cabin began to hum with anxious energy, his thoughts kept returning to the flight attendant. Why was she acting this way? Why had she singled him out? Why did she seem so distant from him when she was so kind to everyone else? Was it just an accident, or was it something more sinister, something deeper, something he wasn't seeing? He shifted in his seat and glanced at her again. This time she was looking at the emergency exit doors, making a mental note of all the safety measures she would need to ensure, but she didn't even glance in his direction. Not once. Her face was set in stone, her body stiff with the coldness he had come to dread. He couldn't help it anymore. The frustration bubbled to the surface. "Excuse me," he said quietly, as she passed his row for what felt like the 10th time. "Could I have a glass of water, please?" She glanced at him this time, her eyes flicking over his face quickly before she nodded sharply and moved away without a word. No apology, no acknowledgement, just the same cold air that had surrounded her since the start. And in that moment he realized something important, something he hadn't quite understood before. He wasn't just a passenger to her. He was an inconvenience, an afterthought, a presence she was determined to ignore. And he could feel the weight of it, like an invisible barrier between them, like he had done something to deserve her disdain. The plane continued its journey through the sky, but the young man couldn't shake the nagging feeling that had taken hold of him ever since he boarded. It was subtle at first, a strange vibe in the air. But as the minutes ticked by, the unease grew into something more tangible, something heavy that weighed on his chest. The cabin had become eerily quiet as the turbulence started to pick up, just slightly, but enough to make the plane dip and sway every now and then, causing a few gasps from the passengers around him. The seatbelt sign flickered on again, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom as the weather began to worsen. But even as the announcement played through the speakers, he could feel something else in the air, something deeper than the storm outside. He glanced up toward the front of the cabin, where the flight attendants were moving quickly between rows, trying to calm the passengers, giving out reassuring smiles. But he noticed that the one who had been so distant toward him was avoiding eye contact with everyone. Her movements seemed robotic, like she was going through the motions without really paying attention to the passengers around her. The man's gut tightened. He could see the slight tremble in her hands as she reached for the overhead compartments to secure them, even though the turbulence hadn't been that bad yet. He wondered what it was about her that made him feel so uncomfortable. Why did he feel so singled out? Why did it seem like she was actively avoiding him? He had traveled for business plenty of times before and had never felt this kind of tension on a flight. Before, he tried to dismiss it as nothing but a combination of nerves and fatigue. But every time he glanced at her, he couldn't ignore the sense of something wrong, something just beneath the surface waiting to come out. As the plane dipped again, the shaking more pronounced this time, the overhead lights flickered and buzzed, unsettling the passengers. Even further, the murmurs of concern spread through the cabin. But still the flight attendants remained eerily calm, almost too calm, as though they were prepared for something worse that was yet to come. The young man watched as the flight attendant who had been ignoring him moved toward the cockpit door, and for a moment she seemed to hesitate, her hand resting just above the handle of the door, her fingers trembling slightly as if she was unsure of something or perhaps afraid of what was to come. Then she pulled away with a deep breath and turned back to the cabin without saying a word. The tension was palpable now, the low hum of the engines filling the silence. As the plane shook again, this time harder, the man gripped his armrest tight, trying to steady his breathing as his mind raced. Something wasn't right. The flight attendants were acting strangely more distant than usual, and there was an underlying fear that no one was addressing, but he could feel it in the air like a storm ready to break. Something was happening, something that hadn't been explained yet. And the longer he sat there, the more he became convinced that whatever it was would be worse than anyone could imagine. He glanced toward the cockpit again, watching the subtle movements of the flight crew behind the closed door. They seemed to be communicating quickly, but without any real urgency. But his instincts told him it wasn't good. He had a feeling they were hiding something from the passengers, and he couldn't ignore it anymore. Suddenly, the plane jolted once more, this time violently, throwing him against the side of his seat. The overhead bins rattled, and several passengers screamed in fear. The seatbelt sign flickered on once more, but this time the urgency in the captain's voice over the intercom was unmistakable. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are experiencing some technical issues. Please stay in your seats and buckle your seatbelts." The tone of his voice was enough to send a wave of panic through the cabin. Even the flight attendants looked momentarily rattled before they regained their composure and began walking down the aisles, offering quick reassurances to the passengers. The young man felt his heart rate quicken as the realization set in. Whatever was happening wasn't just turbulence, it wasn't just bad weather, it was something more, something serious, and the way the flight attendants were reacting told him that they weren't sure they could handle it themselves. But the more he watched them, the more he knew that something wasn't right. Something had broken down, and it wasn't just the plane. And then he saw it, the flicker of a red light above the cockpit door, followed by the faint sound of an alarm. He had heard that sound before in his brief training years ago, and he knew instantly what it meant. The situation was dire. The plane was in trouble, and the one person who had been dismissing him now seemed to be completely unaware of how to handle it. The young man's mind raced as the plane jolted again. This time, it wasn't just a bump in the sky. It felt like a sudden drop, the sinking sensation that made his stomach twist. He could hear the faint gasps of the passengers around him as the plane shuddered with a sudden force, like something was trying to pull it down. His grip on the armrest tightened so hard his knuckles turned white. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom again, but it was more rushed now, more urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing some issues with the aircraft. Please remain calm. We are addressing the situation." His voice faltered just slightly, as if he was trying to keep control of the panic that threatened to seep into his words. He scanned the cabin, quickly trying to gauge the reactions of the other passengers, but it was hard to focus with the growing sense of unease in his gut. He glanced toward the flight attendants and saw them moving quickly through the aisles, their faces now pale, their movements hurried, as they checked the overhead compartments and secured the seatbelt signs. The one who had been avoiding him was now walking briskly down the aisle, her eyes scanning the cabin in a way that felt almost desperate. He could see her hands trembling just slightly as she gripped the back of a seat and tried to reassure a nervous woman sitting near the window, but her words didn't match the look in her eyes. There was fear behind them, fear that she wasn't hiding well enough. His eyes shifted toward the front of the cabin. The door to the cockpit was still closed, but the faint sound of alarms was getting louder now. It wasn't the usual chime of a seatbelt sign or the soft beeping of routine checks. It was the unmistakable sound of a warning light. Something was wrong, and it was getting worse by the second. He could feel the weight of it in the air, the smell of panic creeping in. He stood up slowly, his legs unsteady from the turbulence, but his mind clear. He needed to do something. He couldn't just sit there and wait for the worst to happen. The flight attendant who had been so distant walked by again, and this time he couldn't hold back anymore. He stood in her path. "What's happening? Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. She hesitated for a moment, and then glanced at him, her eyes wide with something that almost resembled fear. "Please sit down, sir. Everything will be fine," she said quickly, her words clipped too quick, almost like she was trying to get rid of him. But he could see it in her face. She didn't believe what she was saying. Her eyes flicked to the cockpit door, and then back to him, almost pleading with him to drop the subject. But he knew now that this wasn't a small issue. Whatever was going on was bigger than anyone was letting on. He pushed past her, slowly moving toward the front of the cabin, trying to stay steady as the plane rocked beneath him. The murmurs of concern from the other passengers grew louder as they began to notice the strange tension in the air, but no one seemed to know what was going on, and no one was telling them. The man felt a pang of frustration. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't sit back and wait for answers, especially when it felt like no one else had any. He approached the cockpit door cautiously. The alarms were louder now, echoing through the thin walls of the plane. He reached for the door handle, but stopped just short, his fingers hovering above it as his mind raced. What if he was wrong? What if it was nothing? What if he was overreacting? But the sound of the alarm was relentless, and his instincts told him that something wasn't right. He turned to look at the flight attendants again. This time, they were all huddled together at the back of the planes, speaking in low, hurried voices. They glanced over at him for just a moment before quickly turning away, like they were hiding something. He knew then that whatever was happening was beyond the control of the crew, and that they were trying to cover it up, keep the passengers calm at all costs. But he also knew that the longer he waited, the more dangerous it became. With a final deep breath, he turned the handle of the cockpit door. It was locked. He pushed harder, but the door wouldn't budge, the sound of the alarms growing louder in his ears. A sense of dread filled him as he realized there was no easy way out of this, no simple fix to whatever was going on. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized the stakes were much higher than anyone was letting on. The young man pulled harder at the cockpit door, his palms slick with sweat. The alarms had grown louder, almost deafening now, each beep an urgent call that something was terribly wrong. And still no one was saying a word. He could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him, the growing realization that the flight attendants weren't just nervous, they were terrified. But no one seemed willing to talk about it. He glanced over his shoulder at the other passengers. They were starting to whisper, eyes wide with unease, but no one dared speak up, not yet, as if waiting for someone else to say the words. He pushed against the door once more, but it didn't move an inch. The lock held fast, and for a brief moment he felt helpless, a sinking feeling in his chest. But that didn't stop him. His instincts were screaming at him to act. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. And the flight attendants were hiding it. They had to be hiding it. They were doing everything they could to keep the passengers calm, to hide the fear that was now evident in their eyes. He knew that if he didn't do something now, no one would. He turned around quickly, scanning the cabin again, trying to figure out what was going on. The flight attendants were still huddled at the back, speaking in hushed tones, but their faces were pale, their shoulders stiff with tension. None of them were smiling now. None of them were pretending that everything was fine. But it was more than just their nervous glances or their tight lips. It was the way they moved now, hurried and erratic, as if they were trying to hide something they couldn't control. He saw one of the attendants near the emergency exit. She was fumbling with the lever, her hands shaking so badly he almost thought she might drop it. The young man took a step toward her, but before he could reach her, she quickly turned away and disappeared into the back of the cabin. His heart started to race, a cold knot forming in his stomach as the pieces slowly began to fall into place. Something was wrong with the plane, and no one was telling anyone what it was. As he moved back toward the cockpit, he caught sight of a flight attendant making her way toward him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. She glanced over her shoulder and then back at him, her mouth opened as if she was about to say something, but no words came out. He could see the panic in her eyes. She wasn't just scared, she was terrified. The flight wasn't safe anymore, and she knew it, but whatever she was about to say was cut off by another loud jolt of the plane. The passengers screamed as the plane dipped suddenly, and the entire cabin seemed to tilt to one side, like it was being pulled down into a violent spiral. He felt the ground shift beneath him, his stomach flipping as the plane dropped several feet, the overhead bins rattling As though they might come loose, the young man gripped the seat in front of him, his heart pounding in his chest. But all he could think was that this was no longer just turbulence. No, this was something much worse. The crew was panicking, and the passengers were starting to lose their composure too. They were shouting now, some of them crying, some of them clutching the armrests for dear life. The flight attendants had stopped moving altogether, now frozen in place, as if they were all waiting for something that was about to happen. And then the captain's voice crackled over the intercom again. But this time it wasn't calm, it wasn't reassuring, it was frantic. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a serious malfunction. Please remain calm. We are doing everything we can to rectify the situation. But his words did little to calm the rising tide of panic in the cabin. The young man could feel it spreading like wildfire. He could see the flight attendants glancing at each other, their faces filled with dread, as the plane shuddered again, this time more violently than before. And suddenly he knew that this wasn't just some mechanical issue. This was something much bigger. He turned back toward the cockpit door, but this time his thoughts weren't about getting inside anymore. His mind was racing with possibilities. They were losing control of the plane, and no one was willing to do anything about it except for him. He had to act, he had to do something, but what could he do alone against whatever was happening to this flight? The sound of the alarms intensified. The plane shook again as though it was caught in a storm of its own, and the young man realized then that it wasn't just his instincts telling him that something was wrong, it was the entire plane telling him the same thing, and the message was clear: they were all in danger, and no one was stepping up to fix it. The young man's heart raced as the plane lurched violently to one side, his body thrown sideways against the seat. The shrill sound of alarms, now drowning out everything else, the screams of the passengers, the frantic chatter of the flight attendants, all blending into a single cacophony of panic. But he couldn't focus on them anymore. His mind was consumed with one thought: how much time did they have left? How much longer before the plane was beyond saving? He glanced toward the cockpit again, the door still closed, locked, but he could see through the small window in the door that the crew inside was moving quickly, their hands shaking as they punched buttons on the control panels, their faces grim and pale. And for a brief moment he saw it in their eyes, the same fear that had been in the flight attendants' eyes, the realization that they were losing control of the plane, and they weren't sure how to get it back. The young man moved toward the emergency exits, now his steps quick and determined. He had to do something, anything. He couldn't just sit back and wait for the worst to happen. But even as he moved, the plane dipped again, this time with a gut-wrenching force that made the entire cabin shake, as though the plane itself was being torn apart. He could hear the panic growing louder now, some passengers crying out in terror, others clutching their loved ones, hands shaking with fear, and all the while the flight attendants remained frozen at the back of the cabin, not knowing what to do or where to go. He reached the emergency exit and stopped there for a moment, his mind racing with the possibilities. What if the plane was about to break apart? What if they were already too far gone? What if opening the door would make things worse? But he couldn't ignore the voice in his head, the one that told him to act, that told him to try anything, because doing nothing would mean certain death. And he knew now that no one else was going to help him. No one else had the courage to step up and take control of the situation. So it was on him, it had to be. He reached out and grabbed the handle of the emergency exit, pulling it down with all his strength. But the door didn't open, it was stuck. And in that moment a rush of panic flooded his chest, his breath catching in his throat. The plane lurched again, the sound of metal groaning under pressure, the walls shaking, and he realized with horror that whatever was happening wasn't just turbulence, it wasn't just a malfunction, it was something much worse. The entire plane seemed to be fighting against them, as though it were trying to pull them down into the abyss. He stepped back from the door, his mind spinning, his thoughts a blur, but then he saw something out of the corner of his eye. A flight attendant running toward him, her eyes wide with panic, and in her hand she held a small radio. The young man's stomach twisted as she approached him, her face pale and drawn. "We need help," she said breathlessly. "We can't stop it, we don't know how." And in that moment he saw it, the crack in her facade, the fear that she couldn't hide anymore, the truth that no one on this plane knew what to do next. He looked at her for a moment trying to process the words she had just spoken, the helplessness in her voice. And then he made a decision without another thought. He grabbed the radio from her hands and rushed toward the cockpit door. He could hear her calling after him. But he didn't stop. He didn't have time for anything else. This was it. This was the moment. He had to make a choice to do something or let them all fall. He reached the cockpit door and slammed his shoulder into it once, twice. But it still wouldn't budge, the weight of the panic pressing in around him like a vice. His breaths shallow, his pulse racing with fear. And then he heard it, the captain's voice coming through the small speaker in the door. "We're losing control. We need help." And those words hit him like a slap across the face, because in that moment he realized the plane was not going to make it unless something changed, unless someone took charge and did something that no one had been willing to do. With a final deep breath, he slammed into the door, once more his body shaking with the effort. And this time it opened the door, giving way to a chaos he couldn't have imagined. Inside the cockpit, the instruments were flashing wildly, lights blinking red, and the crew was frantically trying to regain control, but they were failing. And in that moment, the young man knew he had no choice but to take charge, because if he didn't, no one else would. The young man's breath caught in his throat as the door to the cockpit creaked open, his heart pounding in his ears. The flashing red lights inside the cockpit were blinding, and the sounds of alarms were deafening. He stepped inside without thinking, without hesitation. The sight that greeted him was nothing like he expected. The pilots were hunched over their controls, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear, their hands shaking as they tried desperately to stabilize the aircraft. Every button and switch seemed to be malfunctioning. The instruments were blinking erratically, and the sound of the warning alarms was relentless. The captain glanced up at him in shock, his eyes wide with disbelief. But there was no time for words, no time for explanation. The plane was losing altitude fast. He could feel it with every passing second, the weightlessness that came with a sharp drop, the desperate lurch of the plane fighting to stay in the sky. "What happened?" the young man asked, his voice hoarse. The captain shook his head quickly, his face pale, his hands never leaving the controls. "We don't know," he muttered. "Something's wrong with the hydraulics. We lost control of the rudder." The words hit him like a blow to the stomach. The rudder control was one of the most crucial parts of the plane's ability to stay steady in flight. Without it, they were at the mercy of the wind and the turbulence. The young man glanced toward the co-pilot, who was frantically typing into a keyboard, trying to communicate with the ground crew. The co-pilot's eyes flicked toward him for a brief moment before he turned away, focusing on the task at hand. But the young man could see the fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that comes when you know you've lost control, and there's nothing you can do to fix it. "So what do we do now?" the young man asked, his mind racing. The captain swallowed hard, his gaze never leaving the instruments. "We try to land, we try to get this plane down safely, but it's not looking good." His voice was barely above a whisper, but the words rang in the young man's ears like a death sentence. The young man looked around the cockpit at the flashing instruments, the growing sense of panic that was beginning to creep into his own chest, and for the first time since all of this started, he felt the weight of what was really happening. They weren't just dealing with a technical malfunction. They were fighting to survive. He could feel the gravity of the situation settle into his bones like a cold weight pressing down on him. His mind raced with possibilities as he took a step toward the captain's side. There had to be something they could do, something to turn the tide before it was too late. His eyes flicked over the various buttons and switches on the control panel, but none of them seemed to be responding. None of the systems seemed to be working like they should. The panic in the cockpit was growing palpable, and he knew that time was running out. The captain let out a deep breath as he adjusted the yoke. The plane shuddered violently, as if it was struggling against them, but he kept his grip firm on the controls. "I need you to help me steady this plane," the captain said, his voice strained, but there was a sense of urgency in it that snapped the young man into action. Without another word, the young man grabbed hold of the yoke on the other side of the cockpit. The plane pitched violently again, causing both men to stagger in their seats. The young man clenched his teeth, trying to focus on the task ahead. But the tension in the air was unbearable. It felt like they were fighting against the world itself, trying to keep the plane level as the chaos outside threatened to consume them. The young man could feel the plane slipping beneath them. the weightlessness coming in waves as the ground below seemed to get closer and closer, but still he held on with everything he had. He gripped the yoke tighter, his fingers cramping with the strain, his mind racing with thoughts of survival, how to get the plane down, how to save everyone on board. He glanced at the captain again, who was still staring at the instruments, his face pale and grim. But he saw something else in the captain's eyes, determination, something that said they weren't done yet, they weren't going to give up without a fight. The young man swallowed hard and nodded to the captain. "We can do this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The captain gave him a tight nod, and together they fought against the forces that threatened to tear the plane apart, the wind howling outside, the plane groaning as it fought to stay in the air. They didn't know how much longer they could keep it up, but they both knew one thing for sure: if they didn't pull together now, they would all be lost. The young man's hands were numb, his arms aching from the strain of holding the yoke steady. The plane buckled beneath them, as though it were ready to collapse into the clouds below. The captain's breath was shallow, his brow slick with sweat, as he fought to keep control of the plane. His eyes flicked to the instruments once more, but the flashing red lights seemed to mock him. No matter how hard he tried, the systems weren't responding. Nothing was working. The plane was still sinking slowly but surely. It was losing altitude, and they were running out of time. The young man could feel it deep in his chest, the weight of the situation pressing down on him like a vice. He could hear the panicked cries of the passengers, faintly from the back of the cabin. The urgency in their voices matched the rising terror in the cockpit. They were so close now, so close to the ground. The young man's mind raced with possibilities, but nothing made sense. How could they land the plane when everything was failing? How could they stop the inevitable? The captain's voice broke through his thoughts, hoarse and strained. "We have to try for the nearest runway," he said, barely able to form the words. But the young man saw it in his eyes, the same realization that they might not make it, they might not get the plane down in time. He glanced at the co-pilot, who was still frantically typing into the radio, but the signal kept cutting out. It was useless now. No one was going to save them. They were on their own. The young man nodded grimly, tightening his grip on the yoke. Once more the plane dipped again, a sickening drop that made his stomach lurch. But he held on, even as his vision blurred from the effort. The world outside the cockpit window was a blur of gray clouds. The horizon was just a sliver of light, somewhere far below them. But all he could think about was the distance between them and the ground, between them and survival. "We're not going to make it," the captain muttered almost to himself. The words felt like a weight in the air between them. The young man swallowed hard, the despair in the captain's voice cutting through him. But he couldn't afford to listen to that. He couldn't afford to give up now. Not when they were so close. He glanced again at the runway below them, a thin strip of hope in the sea of nothingness. They had to get there. They had to land somehow. "We will," the young man said firmly, his voice steady in spite of everything. He refused to believe they were done. Not yet, not when they had this last chance. He could feel the captain's eyes on him. But there was no time for doubt, no time for fear. All they had was this moment, this last shot to save everyone aboard. He took a deep breath and adjusted the controls gently. The plane rocked violently beneath him, but he didn't back down. His eyes locked on the distant runway, now visible through the clouds like a beacon in the chaos. It was their only hope, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. The captain's hands shook as he adjusted the speed throttles, trying to bring them closer to the runway, his voice a mere whisper. "We have one shot at this." The young man didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth. They had to make this work, or they were finished. With each passing second, the ground seemed to rise up to meet them, the runway growing larger in the window, and the young man felt the tension in the air thickening with every beat of his heart. They were close now, too close. It felt like they were falling into a trap, a cruel twist of fate. But he kept his focus locked on the horizon. The plane lurched again. But this time, it wasn't as violent. It felt as if the plane itself was starting to obey them, just a little. The young man's fingers were aching from the pressure, but he didn't let go. He couldn't let go. They were almost there, so close. The wheels of the plane touched the runway with a jarring force, the impact sending a wave of shock through his body. But they were down, they were on the ground. The young man couldn't believe it, but the brakes were engaged. The plane was slowing with each passing second. The world outside seemed to shift from chaos to calm as they came to a stop in a cloud of dust and rubber on the runway. He let out a breath he didn't even realize. He was holding the captain slumped forward in his seat, exhausted and relieved. But the young man didn't move, not yet. His hand still gripped the yoke, as though he were afraid the plane might start to fall apart again. But it didn't. It held steady for the first time in what felt like forever. The co-pilot turned to him with wide eyes, the tension in the air still thick, but slowly starting to lift, and the young man gave him a small nod, just a simple acknowledgement of what they had done together. He couldn't help but smile just a little, the relief washing over him, as the weight of what had just happened sank and they had made it, they had survived. As the crew began to unbuckle their seatbelts and the passengers slowly started to realize they were safe, the young man sat back in his seat, his hands still trembling from the adrenaline, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride that he had stepped up when no one else could. And in that moment he knew one thing for sure: he had saved them all.